Hello and welcome to Portfolio Pulse, the go-to podcast for medical professionals and entrepreneurs hoping to learn more about achieving financial wellness, accumulating wealth, and building the life they deserve. In each episode, we either interview a purpose-driven leader or a medical professional that's not only building a business, but giving back to the community as well. We also present subjects in finance that are relevant today. We don't just talk money, we also talk about meaning and maximum impact. Today's featured guest is Neal Brincefield. He has plenty of designations of which he can go into himself, but he is a financial advisor and managing partner of Consolidated Planning Incorporated and a special consultant to the Living Balance Sheet. Neal works to grow CP's advisor base, manage the firm's training and development program, and helps each advisor reach his or her highest potential. As a highly accomplished financial advisor, communicator, and teacher, Neal has also provided training, coaching, and joint work to advisors with other planning firms across the country, and has frequently been a speaker at national industry events. Neal is living in Chapel Hill and got a couple kids there. Man, great to talk to you today. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Tell us how you got into the financial planning world. I know that your dad was in that field, and tell us about the upbringing and what got you involved.
Yeah, I think like a lot of people growing up, I didn't necessarily have a clear sense of what, my parents did for a living, and in particular my dad. And it really didn't appreciate, I knew it had something to do with finance, but didn't really appreciate it until I was also an adult. And I was in a very different industry, and enjoying that, but also frustrated. I was a teacher and was kind of ready to find something new and different to pivot to, and was talking with him about, his experience and what the career path had meant to him. My brother, as you mentioned, had just joined CP about a year earlier. And so it was like a perfect timing to be having those discussions. And I have always viewed it as a great background, a great kind of like training camp to get ready for this industry, to have that teaching background, because so much of what I did in that role, I think applies directly, whether you're talking to a client, whether you're talking to somebody else as advisor or the advisor. There's always an education element to it. So that's kind of how I got here.
That's a great background. I think I first met you at LBS Foundations in Grapevine, Texas, even though we're both pretty local to the Carolinas.
That's right.
So that's my first dealing with you. I've known you a couple of years, but based on what I do know about you, I would have to assume that you either taught physics or history.
Well, yeah, you got it. It was history. So social studies, economics, history, all those topics. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Your demeanor actually fits that pretty well.
I'll take it as a compliment.
It is. So I wanted today's episode to really focus on, we could go into any number of subjects because the financial planning world is so vast, but I really know that you focus specifically on business planning. We've had a couple episodes already talking about how to exit a business. We'll get into that a little bit today, but what is business planning and why is it important?
Yeah, a great question. The reason I think it's so important is because of what the business really means to so many people, starting with the business owner, and then kind of rippling out from that first point of ownership to so many other people that are involved in the business, that are relying on the business to provide for them financially, whether it's the employees, the other partners, their families, even customers and vendors that work with the business, all have a concern, a stake in this business succeeding. So it's as a kind of a bedrock of our society, I think there's a responsibility to do good business planning, then just to think, a little less lofty, a little more practical for that owner. It's all about value. Like how are they thinking about this thing that's on their balance sheet? It's the number one source of financial value. It's the best rate of return that they could ever find to them. What are we going to do from a planning standpoint to protect that value, to help them grow it so that it's bigger in the future than it is today, maybe. And then, like you said, you've talked about exit in some other episodes. How do you realize that value when you exit? So that, to me, you don't get there. You don't answer those questions well. You don't maximize the possibilities if you don't plan in advance. I've done it enough times. I've helped enough business owners get there that I've always found that if they don't plan in advance, they're going to leave something on the table. Somebody's going to be shortchanged, and it'll probably be them if they're not ready to take advantage when that moment comes, whatever that moment might be. But in particular, exit, that's where you got to be ready.
So I know that, most of the listeners on this podcast are either entrepreneurs themselves or the medical professionals, but non-industry specific here. What are the main maybe 3 to 4 problems that you see time and time again business owners have prior to meeting with you? And then what are some of the issues that you help them correct or fix?
Yeah, I mean, I find that there's recurring patterns of problems that come up, and they do tend to fall into these categories that I've always found to be helpful for an owner to be able to break these problems down into smaller pieces, so they feel like we can deal with them and they're not going to be so overwhelming. Big problems that are really easy to fix around having their value unprotected. If your big asset on your balance sheet, because you're just a regular civilian, is a piece of real estate or a brokerage account, there are market forces that could cause that value to be diminished, but there's very few things that could cause that value to go to zero. And when you're a business owner and you don't have protection in place, you don't have a plan in place, and so much of the value is tied up in people and you or a partner or an employee, a couple of bad things could happen. And all of a sudden somebody's sick or injured, somebody passes away, someone leaves, someone files for bankruptcy. The ripple effects can be dire. So that's probably the first problem I see, is just there hasn't been the time and attention taken to getting the basics around protection in place. Buy sell agreement, some simple insurance funding solutions, business continuity plan, some stay bonuses for top people. That stuff's pretty easy to do, and it's really easy to procrastinate on at the same time.
Yeah, in my experience, I think the reason that is because number one, it's not the sexy thing to talk about. It's not going to
Right.
like drive value right away. And number two, nobody likes to think about their own mortality.
That's right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And then it's so if you're right about that, Stephen, and it's hard for one person to do, then I also find in a ownership setting where it's a partnership or there's 3 or 4 owners, that gets even harder potentially to do, because you got to get everybody to sit down and get on the same page. It's really important to do, though. So the more complex things are, the more important the protection becomes. That's one problem. I know you had asked what problems. I mean, another big one is just around, I'll call it the 5 to 7 year rolling exit plan. I've heard this years and years ago, and I've always found it to be true that you talk to owners about when they're going to exit their business, usually because if they're successful and they're running 1,000 miles an hour every day, they often realize they don't want to do this forever. But it's daunting to think about how in the world you're going to get out of this thing. How are you going to sell it? What is it going to mean to your family, to your employees, to your partners? There's just so many factors to weigh in that can be stressful. So most owners, when I ask, like, when are you thinking about stepping back? They'll say something like 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, maybe 10. And this tends to be true that if we stopped right there and we don't have any more discussion and we just waited 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 years and came back, they would give us the same answer, because it's just so easy to procrastinate on that as well. It's a stressful, complex kind of a problem to solve, and it's never going to solve itself. So honestly, if we're talking about a problem to be solved, I find just being the catalyst from an action standpoint to get people to sit down and think about things that maybe are stressful and are big and are kind of complex. That tends to be the hard part. Actually solving the problems, quite frankly, is not that hard.
I think the reason being that that's always a rolling period is because as a business owner, we're so involved in the day-to-day operations. It's hard to delegate, hard to step back and see the big picture for what it is, and then start working piece by piece on trying to, I guess, not distance yourself, but break apart and delegate those important factors of the business to others so that's become a sellable business.
Sure. Totally agree.
So I think it's also difficult to do business planning because it's the largest financial transaction of their lives. It's a high stress and anxiety ridden type of ordeal. Doesn't always need to be, but just the fact of trying to get rid of that, biggest asset on your balance sheet can seem real daunting. There's a lot of family dynamics involved with it too. So, business planning is so important because there are so many different variabilities that you have to plan for.
Right. That's right.
So talk about the different pieces of business planning that you typically focus on with a business planner.
Yeah. So we mentioned one already, which is protection. So that's its own kind of bucket in my experience. Sometimes that's all that we need to address, depending on where the business owner is. But it's about taking that risk away from anything, any element that we could identify and potentially mitigate the risk for, anything that could cause the value of the business to be lessened.
What are those things?
Yeah. So those things would be like it's not so much the concern around the economy or industry changing or updating systems or processes. In my experience, that's up to the owner and the leadership team to kind of figure out. If I'm coming to the table and trying to help them with the financial strategic planning side of things, the big picture risks usually are concentrated in people. So who are the top revenue drivers in the business? Who are the people that have special skills, special knowledge institutionally that would be really hard to replace if we lost one of those people because they passed away, they got sick or injured and couldn't work, they got frustrated and burnt out and decided to go do something else for a living, or even worse, go work for a competitor, across the street. Those types of events for really key people are some of the biggest concerns. And then specifically, I'm always especially concerned about the key people who are also owners, because now I'm not worried about an owner, leaving and going across the street. They're not going to compete against themselves, but I do worry about what would happen if an owner got sick or injured, an owner passed away. How do we successfully and smoothly ensure that they and their family realize the full value of what they've created in such a way that it doesn't break the back of the business, allow the business to be able to live on and move on under new leadership or revised leadership, and not have anybody lose their job, not have anybody's plan get derailed because of that unexpected event. So yeah, Stephen, for protection, it's those types of things.
Good answer.
Perfect. So that's bucket number one.
Yeah.
Like you said, it's easy to procrastinate on, and it's not the sexiest thing to talk about. What that kind of leads to, though, you talk about the problem of employees. A huge area of focus is around growing the business, and here again, most growth happens through people. The details that are not people are important, but that's usually something the owner and the leadership team are going to deal in. How do we maximize efficiency and the use of capital and all that good stuff? At the end of the day, a person drives those decisions. A person drives sales. A person drives cost control. And if that person really is key, if they're really hard to replace, we're going to get to a point where it is far less costly to set up a plan to retain them financially than it would be to have to ever replace them financially. So I just find that I end up spending a lot of time and doing a lot of work around building different types of retention plans for key people who are not owners. They don't have a stake in the company that's naturally tying them there. What can we do to align their attitude, their actions, their behavior with the owners? Even align their time frame, their tenure with the owners. So for instance, if you're an owner and you have a plan to sell the business, in 5 years, well, the last thing I want to have happen is your top producer, salesperson, office manager, whoever that key person is, leaves in 3 years because they, want to retire themselves, or they get fed up and burnt out and they go do something else. Pension plan that gave them a really powerful financial incentive to hang around for 5 years or maybe even 6 years to see you through that transition. They're rewarded for it. Their time frame is now aligned with yours. And if I'm that buyer who's coming to take a look at your company, I love the idea that these critical people that are driving profitability have a mechanism that's kind of tying them to the business for at least a little while the transition is happening.
It's common in M&A. I mean, you want that type of strategy for any, big company that's getting sold, depending if you're $5 million up to $500 million, you need that type of strategy.
Exactly. And it's easy to think like, well, that's something for those big guys, but it's totally relative and scalable. And I would say the key person risk is even greater in a small business where you've got 20 employees, because to lose one now that's 5% of the workforce, and that person, that 5%, probably punched above their weight class and represented way more than 5% of the profitability of the company. So yeah, it's even more important when it's a small company.
Interesting. Yeah. So business, since the people are the most important asset, you got to grow. You got to grow through the employees, because when the employees are happy, then the client base can continue to grow also, and so everybody feels incentivized to make it work.
That's right. Exactly. You got a good person and you invest in them, whatever the cost to retain them it happens to be, the ROI on that should always be a pretty great one. So
Always less expensive than hiring a new person and training.
absolutely.
Always.
That's right. They're so hard to find, people like that you just know you can count on. So hard to find those people. It's so easy to keep them if you keep the right plans in place. But you got to sit down and take the time to figure that out. And that's the hard part.
Mm-hmm.
So that protect and grow, right, are the first two areas. But where everything ultimately leads back to is this question of how you're going to exit the business one day. And probably the first order of business there, honestly, Stephen, is that the owner's got to recognize that you will exit the business one day. It's going to happen no matter what. You're either going to sell the business, or you're gonna die owning the business. And sometimes that might be the plan. Sometimes that's a surprise, but you should be ready either way, right? And so within those options of, sell it or keep it until the end, there's really three doors. If we kind of broke it down and got specific, you could either sell to a third party, and that's pretty straightforward. A third party comes in and they write you a check, usually for up to 80% maybe at closing, and then you might have an earn out period for some stretch of time. A lot of variation there, but that's typically the shape of that third party sale. So what do you do to maximize that result? What do you do to mitigate the problems along the way? The second door would be also a sale, but not a sale to a third party. This would be like a sale to what we call an insider. It's your partner, it's a key employee, it's a family member. The thing that all those people have in common is that they are broke for the purposes of buying you out, right? So they don't have cash to write you a check for what your practice is worth, what your business is worth. It is almost always true that is just the case on a relative basis. And if they don't have the cash to write you a check for $1 million or $5 million, then they probably also don't have the collateral to go to the bank and get financing for that same amount of money. So the only way that insider is going to buy you out is through owner finance. So the challenge of the inside sale is that your business have to kind of be the source of financing, and it's going to be the future cash flow of the business that is going to make that deal work. There's a lot of risk involved. There's a lot of potential taxes involved. And so that's what maybe makes that path a little bit tricky. But it actually, in my experience, is the most common path. Because the beauty of it is that you've got you got a guaranteed buyer there kind of waiting in the wings. If you can find them and you can groom them and you can retain them up to the point where the sale begins, you got a little more control on an inside sale than the third party sale. And you know what you're getting, because you've kind of created the market and you've created your buyer to some degree.
Ask this question real quick. So about the insider sale, since the future cash flow is providing that new buyer with the cash flow in which to pay back the seller, is it more important for them to sell that business on an upward trajectory of growth?
Yeah, 100% true. I think there's almost no scenario where things aren't better if the cash flow is improving over time. But this is where it's like a requirement to some degree, and it's really hard to do. But the reason it's a requirement is that your buyer in this case, who by the way is new at this, right? They're probably an unseasoned owner operator. They've never sat in the owner's chair before in a lot of cases. They've got to keep the business running. They've got to grow that cash flow. And part of the reason they've got to stay profitable and make it more profitable is that they owe you money. They owe you payments every year. They've got like a deductible to hit before they reinvest in the company or even buy gas and groceries. So yeah, you gotta, the health of the company cash flow wise has got to be pristine. It should be. It's going to work better for everybody if that's the case as you walk into that kind of an inside sales scenario.
So if we're trying to continuously grow the value of this business prior to sale, what are some things a business owner could do?
Yeah, I mean, the big thing is looking at cash flow, and this, you'll see this recurring theme. It's going to come back to people here, but the reality is that most businesses, and especially these days, service-based businesses, which is, again, most businesses in the US these days, it's not about a factory. It's not about, a bunch of equipment. Sometimes it is, but it rarely is compared to, say, 30 or 40 years ago. It's about multiples of cash flow, and multiples of revenue sometimes, but most often it's a multiple of earnings. And so what you can do is look at all the ways to increase the top line, all the ways to decrease the expenses, the costs, to increase that bottom line, because that earnings or EBITDA, sort of a metric, is going to be how you're judged out there in the marketplace. The only other factor is the multiplier. So is it your business selling for 3 times EBITDA, 4 times EBITDA? The ways that you can increase the multiplier would be, for example, how turnkey would the business be for the new owner? The easy thing to do is to take yourself out of the equation. Like, the hardest businesses to sell are the ones where the owner is so integral, so consequential to the day-to-day success of the business that it's hard to fathom somebody else stepping in and running it. If that's how ingrained you are in your business today, you don't have a business that is as sellable and as valuable as it potentially could be. Replace yourself, make yourself inconsequential, which is counterintuitive maybe, but hire someone else to do what you do. Systematically replace yourself, even if it takes a few people to do it, because now you have an actual business to sell instead of just a job to sell to somebody else. And the business is always going to sell for more, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
So that's probably the biggest one I see. The biggest mistake I see maybe is just not thinking about taking yourself out of the equation.
Well, one thing that I'll tell business owners is if things aren't right at home, it's gonna be a lot harder for them to be right at work. So
Yeah,
how important would you say personal planning is as part of the whole business planning operation?
it's huge, and it's huge for. I mean, the simple reality is that eventually that question comes home to roost, because there's going to be an intersection between your business balance sheet and your personal balance sheet. Exit is the easiest example to give you. What happens when a business owner sells? They are trading a business that produces cash flow for, now, after that check is written and deposited, it's a portfolio that has to produce cash flow instead, maybe because we're walking into retirement. So you can't have done zero personal planning to get there. You've got to have a plan. You got to be ready to all of a sudden figure this out and turn that pile of money, those assets, back into cash flow, and do it for X number of years in the face of market risk, not business risk now. So how do you do all that? That's a different question. Just like we want to prepare for exit with planning, you got to prepare for with business planning, rather, you got to prepare for exit in your post-exit life with personal planning. That's true on the retirement side. It's also true, though, just like today, now, even if you're years from exit, probably the biggest mistake I often see for that kind of a scenario is that you might have some protection planning in place for your business, but not on the personal side. So, like, your personal legal documents aren't squared away. That can come back into the business in a lot of cases. It can negatively affect the business, as well as hurting kind of people at home financially if things aren't sewed up. So I always look at them as parallel lines. If you're going to tackle these issues for business planning, looking at protection, you're looking at growing the business value, business balance sheet, what your exit strategy is going to be. Let's do the same thing in parallel, or maybe in 2 steps. What is the personal financial situation? Are you protected personally? Are you saving enough money to grow that balance sheet? Where's money going? And then, what is that retirement plan ultimately as you exit from your working years and go into the next phase?
So in my experience, you're hitting it dead on. I mean, in my experience, because there's so many things you need to address with a client, whether it's in 3 to 5 years or longer, is to
Yep.
keep it simple for them, because they have so much moving parts they need to focus on. So I think a 5-step process is something that can be taken and addressed all these issues. So number one is just trying to get people super financially organized, both on their personal balance sheet as well as the business balance sheet. That may take a little bit of effort, gathering the data. Things aren't always typically in the same place. So you have this, like you described, the financial junk drawer. People have all these things moving. So how do we organize them together so they can see it for what it is and see the growth
Right.
over those 3 years? And then do the personal planning, then do the business planning, and then help them realize the value of their life's work by getting a good exit strategy in place. And then lastly is just seeing how that all kind of either they can use those proceeds to create a new business if they're young enough, or if they want to just retire at 50 once their business is sold. That's the fifth step is just understanding, what is it that you want to do after all this is done? And it couldn't be any simpler than that.
That's right. The as even as you describe it, Stephen, those steps are easy. Getting started is the hard part. So just that to me is the key, is like, let's take the pressure off the rest of it. Just get the process started. And those details generally work themselves out pretty easily.
Well, for the last 5 minutes I have with you, what are some of the reasons why someone would not work with a financial planner or advisor to do this? And what certification should they be looking for that would qualify the advisor to work with them on these particular issues?
Yeah, well, so in particular for the question around business planning and exit planning,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's critical that if you're going to work with somebody, they've got a specialty in that area. One indicator of that would be, a designation that kind of demonstrates that they've done some additional outside study. The certified exit planner designation is one of those. There are a few others out there, but that to me gives us that confidence that this is a planner who isn't just looking at your portfolio, that actually has some experience dealing in these types of issues that are wholly unique to business planning. You talk about what are some reasons why somebody maybe wouldn't work with an advisor. I find that often there's an assumption made. I mean, it's really common actually to encounter this. There's an assumption made that when the time comes, I've got an attorney and I've got a CPA, I've got a tax professional, I have an insurance agent, I've got somebody that comes in and helps us with benefits. Like these people together, or one of them, in particular, maybe the attorney or the CPA, they're going to have these answers from an exit perspective. And what I have always found is that is it's a really unfair assumption for that attorney or that CPA, because that's not what they're doing. And it's not what they're tasked to do. It's not what they're intending to do. They're helping in this very specific areas that they deal in. It's this year's taxes. It's getting the legal documents today in place so they're appropriate. That's really different than asking, what are the implications, right, of one sales strategy versus another over the next 20 or 30 years? So the reality is that you really want somebody to come in who that's what they do. That's the set of problems that they're looking to solve. It's long-term, it's strategic. And somebody that serves in that role should be capable of helping you to coordinate and align all those other great advisors and great professionals you have in the mix to get everybody on the same page around the plan. So it's just like anything else. You gotta find somebody that can orchestrate that, and they've got the skill set and hopefully therefore the confidence that you'll have as a result, because that this is not their first rodeo, and they've seen this before a time or two.
The designations that I know of that people can be looking for, and these aren't necessarily just exclusive to advisors, attorneys, and I think CPAs can have these as well, which one is the CEPA, and then the other one I know of is CEXP, which both you and I are qualified under that.
Yep, that's right.
The organization piece is huge for that. It's those people are really great at what they do in a microeconomic level, but what you're looking for is someone who can coordinate all those efforts of all those professionals with you and for you on a macroeconomic level, on a bigger scale. That's where we really come in and help add value. Yeah,
well said. It's exactly micro versus macro.
So to whom is this discipline useful? Who does it benefit?
I mean, so many people, honestly, Stephen. Of course it's going to benefit the owner, but it's like think about the ripple effects, like the pebble and the pond and the ripples that come out of that. Their family, generations of their family, could be affected either incredibly beneficially or maybe negatively by the planning that is or isn't done. That then multiplies for the partners their families. You've got three owners, you've got three partners, maybe three generations for each family that are being affected. And then beyond that, if the owners have a financial kind of cash flow concern and the business succeeding, so do all the employees. They're deriving cash flow. They're deriving their family's financial stability and security, their financial future from this business. And if it succeeds, if it grows, if it's successful, then they're going to be able to be financially successful. So now it's about their personal balance sheets, their families, their kids and grandkids. And that ripple, to me, it keeps going even to other businesses and all the people in those businesses that work with and rely on this business to succeed. Because this business is either they're either paying or being paid by those other individuals and those other businesses that they're interacting with. So everybody either wins or loses when great plans are put in place and they unfold the right way. And there's almost no limit to how far those connection points can go. So
So instead of
it's a
just
big
looking
deal.
at it, yeah, I mean, instead of just looking at it intrinsically, thinking about how the moves you're making today and the decisions that you'll make tomorrow are extrinsically affecting those inside your business, the families inside the business, the employees of that business, and then externally out more to the community and other businesses involved.
That's right. That, to me, it's about legacy in a lot of ways. The owner, I love working with owners that appreciate that and that recognize that there's a financial element to the conversations we're having, but that when they've built something, especially when you built something from scratch, you've grown it to be this thing that didn't exist before you showed up, that all these lives impacted by it. It's a huge legacy that you've created that you want to be able to live on. And planning, your efforts are what created it, but planning is what's going to allow it to kind of live forever if you put the right pieces in place. So it's a huge deal. It's too important to not take the time to really ask those questions and go through that process the way you described it.
For any business owners that are anywhere near thinking that they are ready to get out of the business, anybody who just wants to understand a little bit more of what's involved, reach out to me, reach out to Neal Brincefield. Neal, where can we find you? What are some handles or some contact information for you?
Yeah, I mean, you can always. I think the easy place is go to our website, and you can find contact information for me. You can find information for maybe even some of our associates that might be like right there in your local community. But it's the Consolidated Planning website, www.cplanning.com.
Awesome. Thanks so much for your time today, man. I'll put all your information in the liner notes for those who's listening, and I'll talk with you soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Stephen.